Okay, I would like to start by saying thank you for the invitation. I find Finland is one of those countries that actually is really inspiring in terms of their digital cultural heritage. You seem to have the ability to work together to have an impact online that is greater than the size of your country would suggest. So it's a privilege to be here. Thank you. So what I want to talk about is crowdsourcing as a form of participatory heritage. So there's a sort of necessary definitions bit. And then I'll show you some key examples. And while I'm showing you those examples, I'll talk about some of the things that makes those projects successful. And then I'll move on to thinking about the impact that crowdsourcing can have and some of the challenges that it creates for organizations running projects. When I was looking at the program, I was really glad to see this sentence here that museums with impact don't just happen. You need to actively foster dialogue and seek to have an impact on society. I think that's a really important acknowledgement because there's a shift that needs to happen in terms of how we organise projects, in terms of our attitudes to relationships with the public. We can't keep doing the same things that we've been doing in terms of producing catalogues, exhibitions, broadcast programs, and expect that it's going to work online in the same way. So I think it's a really important moment to see a line like that in the invitation that I got to speak here. So the necessary definitions bit. The term crowdsourcing was coined in 2006, and it really came from the world of business, so organisations looking at outsourcing the kinds of work that they were doing internally. The thing that made it really scary for organisations, and I think really was key when they coined the term, was this open call to people online. So they didn't know who would respond, and it immediately raises questions about how do you know the quality of the work that someone's contributing? Why are they spending time with your project? What's their real reason? Are they going to try and do you harm? Are they trying to get something for free? So that was a moment when people were really thinking about new relationships that the internet enabled in some ways. But I find the idea of cognitive surplus to be a slightly more useful concept. It's the idea that we've got a very highly educated populations. We're not spending the same time that we used to on manual tasks. We have tools that will take care of a lot of those things for us. So we have a lot of free time compared to what we had in the past. So that time could be spent watching television, but it could also be spent writing Wikipedia entries. You could be making edits on OpenStreetMap. You might be running your hobbies. You might have book groups. There's lots of things that you can be doing with your free time now. And one of those things is contributing to projects online. Because crowdsourcing and cultural heritage is slightly different, we don't offer money, we can't give people micropayments in exchange for their work. So the motivations have to be different. We really have to provide mutual benefit for both parties in crowdsourcing. So what the tasks that we're offering, as well as the goals, the reason that you're doing it, they should be inherently rewarding. So it's one thing to say you should help the museum because helping a museum is a good thing to do, but it should also be something that's enjoyable to do. So you're not making a sacrifice, you're actually doing something that's enjoyable. It has to be a mutual exchange, which means that both parties have to think about what they're gaining and how they have to compromise to collaborate with each other. And the reason I say it has to be a shared significant goal is it's not just asking someone to help you with your homework. If you say, where should I go for dinner, and someone gives you a suggestion, you get a great dinner, and they maybe get the feeling that they've given some expert advice, but it's not an equal exchange. So it has to be something that everyone benefits from when the goal is achieved. So a simple way of thinking about it is transforming some kind of input content, because we are organisations that hold records, we hold collections, so it might be digitised images or images of books, that is transformed into some kind of output content via a task that is motivated by a powerful purpose and ideally an enjoyable task as well. So there's a lot of work to do in the design to make sure that the project feels like a compelling thing to do, as well as the individual task is compelling. And I should also say thank you to, I think some of these photos are from a Swedish organisation that's digitised photos of Helsinki. So participatory heritage isn't only crowdsourcing, it's also just sharing content online so that people can do things with it. So throughout this, you might spot some photos of Helsinki. I think this is in the grounds of a church somewhere. So one way that I find really useful to think about crowdsourcing partly because I'm used to working with museums that are more comfortable thinking in analogue than digital ways, is thinking about it as volunteering. So people participate for the same reasons that they work as volunteers. They gain new skills, they gain new friends, they have a meaningful activity to do, it helps them structure their time. So if you've worked with volunteers who might come into your building or work with you in other ways, you've already got a lot of experience that translates really well to working with crowdsourcing online. So the same kinds of motivations carry across, the same considerations. When I talk to people who work with volunteers, often things like providing biscuits and free tea and coffee is really important. Providing a break room that volunteers can go to is really important in terms of maintaining volunteers. You also have to think about is everyone going to turn up on a Saturday and no one's going to turn up on a Sunday? So there are kinds of logistical issues to do with managing where and how people participate that carry over really well. So there's probably quite a few in this room who might have volunteered in the past to start your career. You might know people who volunteer, or you might have run volunteer projects. So that kind of experience is really helpful. It creates a level of empathy that helps you design good projects. The thing about online volunteering is it's much more convenient. You can do it anywhere, anytime. The advent of tablets, I think, has been particularly important because people spend a lot of time, they might be watching TV, they might have a glass of wine, but they can also faff around on the tablet. Designing for tablets can be tricky because the keyboard is on the screen. But there is an opportunity there with people who wouldn't previously have been home computer users. One thing I really like about online crowdsourcing is that people can do it earlier than they might otherwise take up a hobby. So we're seeing family historians can start doing research in their 30s, where previously they might have waited until they were retired. They had time to go and visit the archives, to plan those trips, to go and look at records. Now they can fit it in around business trips, they can fit it in around dropping their kids off at school. It also means that you can reach people in ways that really has scaled up, in ways that we couldn't have thought previously possible. So you can reach perhaps Finnish diaspora, communities abroad who might want to practice their Finnish language skills or might want to do family history research and who'd be glad of an opportunity to interact with content online. Though previously it would have been very difficult or expensive for them to come and interact with your content. It also means that you can reach really broad audiences and very specialist audiences. So there might only be 3 teaspoon collectors in a particular village, but you could reach them all even though they're on the other side of the country from you. Often the kinds of tasks that people do are microtasks, so they're little tiny things. This is a very extreme example. It's from Family Search, which is family history online. They wanted to create an app that someone could use while waiting in line in a restaurant was their rationale. So the idea being that you've got a bit of time, you can start to type in and transcribe some of these records. As you type in the words, you are digitising historical birth, death and marriage records. They've tried to take into account the fact that handwriting can be quite tricky to interpret if you've only got a small sample, so you can flip over and view the handwriting in context. But you can see that with the keyboard on the screen, it's a real challenge. And I think that's something that we need to think about as organisations. If we're sitting at our desks and we've got a beautiful iMac and we're designing for that kind of experience and someone's on an old Android phone, what's their experience like? What are the audience that we want to attract? What are they using? But it's this kind of really quick task. It's very simple, it's not complex. It's a relief in a world that is very busy, that is full of very complex tasks, to do something that is done very quickly. And that's one reason why crowdsourcing is so compelling. And I always like to point out that crowdsourcing wasn't really invented around the internet. There's a number of examples, but this one is the Oxford English Dictionary. The people who were compiling the dictionary were looking for the earliest examples of words in use, perhaps in printed books. And they kept at it for a number of years, and eventually they realised they couldn't do it by themselves. So they did 2 different appeals to the reading public where they asked people to send in examples of words. Sometimes it was just like an interesting word, an unusual word that you've noticed. Sometimes they printed specific lists of words and asked for examples of those words in use. And they got back these slips of paper. And they had to manage these slips of paper and work out who'd sent what, which one was sent first, who should get credit for suggesting a particular word, who was an authoritative person. One of the most prolific contributors turned out to be a guy who was in prison. He was very, very good at what he did, but you might not have wanted to, you might have thought about differently about his entries. had you known that. So there was a massive process. They had tons and tons of mail. There was actually a post box outside the editor's house because he got and sent so much mail. So crowdsourcing online takes away all that work. Computers can do the work of matching. We can search really quickly and find who's done what. We can validate people's entries, so we can look for errors. We can look for people trying to be malicious and sneak stuff in. We can manage all these processes that used to take up rooms and rooms and years to do. We can manage them really quickly and instantaneously. The same issues, if they used to actually put their requests for words in magazines that people subscribed to, and they'd only reach the subscribers of those magazines, but now you can reach anyone online. So it has created a level of scale in terms of reach, in terms of speed, that has really transformed crowdsourcing, but it wasn't invented by technologists. And just a quick reminder of why we actually need people to help us with tasks. This is the newspaper storage room outside of York from the British Library, so this is the material that I work with. There's a lot of it. The British Library has between 180 and 200 million collection items. About 2% are digitised. We'll never get through them. It's a very long way off anyway. So the work of describing collections, of making them accessible, of transcribing the text, it's all beyond the resources that we have at the moment. So we need people's help. But it's also about creating meaningful experiences. It's about saying, your heritage is shared by everyone. You should have access to it. You should have a relationship with it. You should feel like you can get to it when you want to get to it. It's about creating opportunities for people to meet others, to bond over these things that they have in common, to create stronger relationships in society. Having come from a country that voted against Brexit, I think it's really important that people know the history, they understand why something like the European Union was important. So a sense of how things change over time. As we heard in the first keynote, that sense of how things operate in different parts of the world, that sense of being part of a global connection is really important. So I think working with historical materials, whether it's transcribing text or tagging images, is a really great way to get a sense of our shared heritage while meeting new people and having fun. But I think it's also about providing opportunities for learning. So there's a lot to be said for just simple source familiarity, that sense if you've looked at lots of photographs, you've got a sense of what's normal. So if you see something unusual, you're more likely to recognize it. People might use cultural heritage records in their own research. They could be researching the history of knitting and they look at your page. Or they might use it in shared projects, so they might be building resources together. And those are all opportunities for learning, and we'll look at some other ways that that learning might happen as well. But it's not just about productivity. So some quick examples, really just to make sure that you all have a sense of what I'm actually talking about. We're going to move from things that are type what you see to more complex tasks. So who's had to deal with one of these when you want to leave a comment somewhere or sign up to a website? Okay, so if you raised your hand then, or if you've seen this before, you are helping digitize historic books. So the text, one of the two words that you had to type in was from a book where the optical character recognition software wasn't able to quite make out the word, and the other one was a test to make sure that you weren't being naughty. So every time you did one of those, you were digitizing very slowly historic books. If you did the audio version, because you had low vision, then you were helping transcribe historical radio broadcasts. So it's a really clever way of saying people have to do this kind of task anyway, so let's make the most of all that cognitive energy, all that time that's going into this, and get something further from the process. Although these days, if you do it, you're probably just helping Google digitize street numbers on Street View. Slightly less exciting. There's two finished examples in this talk. So this is from the National Library of Finland and a company called Microtasks. You had to type in the word up here, and as you did that, it would kind of build a bridge so that the moles wouldn't fall off the end and die. Hands up who had a go. This was launched in 2011. Okay. I think it had about 50,000 contributors in the end, so you're some of those contributors. I can't read Finnish, but I had a go. It kind of added to the level of challenge. I was not very good. But they also built in a game where they would check the words that you'd added, so they'd validate the data that you got back. Because one thing that museums really worry about is the fact, how do we know that we can trust people? So building in tasks that check what people have done is a great way to take the worry off you and make sure that it's still completed properly. So this is an early, really sort of convincing project. The National Library of Australia they wanted to digitise their historical newspapers. The software that detects the words was not very good at that point. So they thought, well, what if we just let people correct errors when they see them? So if you can see the word underlined in red, it's someone's name, but it's not being recognised correctly because often, names are hard for software. They're so varied, they're not very good at recognising them. So if you see an error, you can then and there you can correct it. And they thought that people who use newspapers for the historical research would do this a little bit, and it would gradually help do things. But it's such a satisfying interaction to do. It's so simple, just change a few letters, and then suddenly you've fixed whole lines of text, that some people do it just because. They just do it for fun. So it's actually been really productive. They've had about 200 million lines of text corrected since they launched. And you can see, it's a really satisfying interaction. You can see the difference that it makes. This line of text here that was, it was all messy and horrible. They weren't real words. But now they're names again. So you're having an impact on the world. As soon as you've completed a task, those words are searchable. So someone who was looking for John Trotter can find that record now, where previously they would have had no results. And you can see that. So as a user, you've got a real sense that you've made a difference in the world. And that's a really good feeling. It also helps reassure you that there's a trail so that any changes that are made are kept. So if you're a historian using this resource, you can go back and see if some school kid has signed up and written, John Trotter was fat, then you can see that change and you can roll it back yourself. So it's all very transparent. This is another one of my favourite projects, the New York Public Library What's on the Menu. One of the key messages from this project is really choose fabulous material. Those menus that they have are they're gorgeous to look at. Everyone can relate to menus because everyone has to eat at some point. They talk about prices, so you can see social historians, all kinds of historians have many uses for them. But they've done a lot of really clever things with the design. So they've anticipated some of the questions that you might have. If you can read it, it says, it's easy, no registration required, because as soon as you see a website, you're like, am I going to have to register? Am I going to have to make a username and think of a password and then wait for the email thing? And by the time I get the email, I've forgotten why I wanted to do the thing in the first place. So you don't need to do any of that. They've anticipated that anxiety and dealt with it. They've made it really obvious where to start. Working in academia, academics like to write a lot of text. So they might be saying, you can help us with this project, but it would be buried in paragraphs of text. They've literally got hands pointing at the place where you start. You can't miss what you have to do. They're showing you how much they value the material. So they're showing you, here are some of the menus that we've loved and learnt about through this project. There's contact information, and there's a reason to do it. So help us, it's a unique collection. So they're giving you lots of reasons to get started. They've thought about the barriers that might stop you having a go, and they've removed them one by one. And they've also got a really sharp focus on the size of the task. So they make the tasks as tiny as they possibly can make them. The software puts the arrow on the screen to tell you which line that you're transcribing. All you have to do is type in the word and type in the price. They've anticipated your questions again. So, don't worry about accents. What do you do if there's more than one price for a dish? They're familiar with the material, so they can anticipate the questions that you've got. It's one reason why developing crowdsourcing projects isn't a cheap answer, because you need to think about, what issues are people going to encounter with this? What kinds of random records are going to be thrown up that they might be put off by? And then we go from really sort of simple type what you see tasks from handwritten text to Jeremy Bentham's handwriting, which is small, difficult to read. He writes across the page, he writes marginalia. And because this is a kind of digital humanities project, they've asked people to mark it up in an XML format, which means lots of angle brackets and thinking about how you label things. So it's a really complex task. It might take people half an hour to transcribe a page. So we've gone from things that you can do a couple of in a minute to something that's really going to be a commitment. But again, the mission, the reason that people are doing this has been important enough for people to devote time to the task. And there's lots of things that you can do to sort of bridge that gap between really complex material. So increasingly we're seeing people do things like crowdsourcing, the tasks that you do before you crowdsource. So they're saying, is this image good enough to study? And the idea is that some images are blurry, some images, there's just too much noise to go in, and some of them are just fine. So that process of looking at images gets you familiar with the material. You start to get a sense of, this is looking at the ground in areas where there's fossils, so ideally you'd be able to spot fossils amongst the stones. So it's getting you familiar with the kinds of the normal range of terrain, so that you're more likely to feel confident that you've spotted a bone when you do spot a bone. It's a really subtle way of building up your skills without making you do a tutorial. You don't have to read text or watch a video. You just start with a nice simple task. One of the really common formats that we see is people tagging images. There's something really immersive, particularly with art, that people find it really rewarding. They kind of get into flow because just describing what you see in an image is relatively simple. You can go all fancy with the words if you want to, but you don't have to. And then it makes the images more discoverable. So immediately these paintings are findable in something like Google, where previously we were relying on metadata and the cataloguing that might have been done 100 years ago to be able to find this image. And then we get sort of more varied tasks. This is a project at the British Library, georeferencing maps. So again, some people really love maps. They find them, they just like spending time looking at maps. And there's something about the kind of enjoyable puzzle. I was doing this one earlier. I was like, okay, public gardens, that doesn't tell me much about where this might be, but there's a street called Porta Venezia. So I Googled Porta Venezia to see where it might be, and then realized that I could probably line those things up. So there's an enjoyable puzzle. You don't know the answer, it's an open-ended question, but it's still relatively simple because you're looking for typed place names. The first version of this was completed within a week, even before the press release had been written, because people were just so excited to get their hands on the British Library's map collections and to do something interesting with those collections. And then we get into more complex tasks. This was an experimental project from the Museum of Design in Plastics, so very niche as projects go. What they wanted to do was to find more information for some of their objects. So they'd nominate a question that they had for each. They wanted to know who designed things, who made things. We know that there are lots of people with really specific knowledge about design in plastics. It might be collectors who hang out on eBay. It could be academics who study the history of design. Because plastics are relatively recent, there's a lot of people who work for these manufacturing firms or who worked in the retail stores that sold them that have bits of knowledge about these collections. But it's really hard to put these objects under their noses. You kind of have to put them online and hope that eventually they find them. They did have a number of successes, but they also used Facebook, and a lot of people who worked were kind of reluctant to link Facebook to this because I think if Facebook is your social space and maybe where you go to look at pictures of your grandkids or to talk with your schoolmates, then doing something a bit nerdy about design in plastics doesn't fit with your Facebook persona. So there's something about choosing the right platform for the right audience. So one thing that we've learned from all this is that niche projects can be really effective. So it's things that call to a very specific interest that someone might have. This is another one of my favorite projects, the Smithsonian Transcription Center project. One really clever thing they've done is they have very small projects. So a project might be as small as a notebook or an archival box of material. So it means that they can celebrate these successes. We've completed a new project really often, which means that people feel good about what they've done, they come back, they've got stories to tell their friends and families. It's validating what they're doing. It's like, you helped make this a success. Have a go at another one. And they've used these individual descriptions. There's lots of interesting points in here. So you might think, if they're saying, if you can read Czech, then we need you. So if you've got language skills, then you've got something to do with them. They've got lots of dates, places, topics. So all of these things are like little tantalizing things thrown out into the world, and you might see something that attracts you, whether it's a kind of species that someone was looking at, whether it was a place that they went to, or the time that they were doing it. So small projects, breaking things down into small sizes works really well because it gives you lots of ways to celebrate success, and designing things that are very niche means that you might reach those people who are really deeply interested in what you're doing. There's lots of people who might say, oh yeah, I like your museum, but some people will have very detailed conversations with you exactly what they like about your museum, which are the collections they use. They might not care about the collections in the next storeroom, but the ones that they use, they'll be very deeply attached to. So I think one of the key tips I'd give is to think about motivations as design guidelines. When we're designing exhibitions, we tend to think more about, what are the learning outcomes of the exhibitions, which are the target audiences, how will we market it, what kinds of programs will we run around it. For online projects like this, really thinking about motivations is the best place to start. Jane McGonigal's work, it's a video that she did in 2009, and it actually really summarizes a lot of the kind of extensive research that I read for my PhD, where people want to master new skills, they want the feeling of being good at something, they want to do something that's bigger than themselves, that kind of altruistic drive to contribute. They want to spend time with people that they like, so people who've got a similar interest. And they want satisfying work to do, so work when you've done it, it feels a bit better than having watched reality TV all night. So these are some examples which I think do a really nice job of tying into different kinds of motivations, and in some instances giving you a hint of what it is that you're going to do. So they range from the really serious, bring a family together, help us know the names of these children, to kill time, make history. So they call to different audiences depending on the kind of project that it is. Historians need your help is really simple, but sometimes simple is as effective as anything more clever. So thinking now about different kinds of impact that you can have, and I think one of the key forms for me is productivity. So a lot of these projects have really impressive numbers in terms of how many millions of lines have been corrected, how many comments they've gotten, how many identifications they've made of objects. This is the Trove Hall of Fame. So this man here has corrected 400,000 lines of text. For one individual, that is an incredible contribution. That is hours and hours and hours and weeks, probably months of his life, cumulatively over the life of the project. The problem with doing the metrics like this is that people will go towards the metrics that you're publishing. So think really carefully about what it is that you value in a project. In some projects, it might be that you can transcribe text, but you can also comment on what's on the page. So we'll see this with war records, with ships records. So if you prioritize how many pages people do, then a lot of people will just focus on getting through pages as quickly as they can. If you prioritize spending more time with things, noticing interesting things, if you reward people for noticing something interesting, then some of their energy will go to that. So like any other project, think really carefully about how you're going to report success, what you're going to measure, because that will have an effect on what people do. It will actually directly affect their behavior. So another way of thinking about impact is about reach. The Zooniverse, which is a citizen science project largely, they run all kinds of things from identifying, looking at galaxies, looking at nature, also transcribing things like ship's logs. They have over 1 million volunteers. I think it might even be 2 million by now. That is an incredible number of people for an organisation to say that they've reached, that they have a relationship with that many people. This is a visualisation of where their contributors come from. So you can see that their reach is very international. You can also see that obviously you can only reach people who are easily able to get online with the kinds of devices that you need to run these projects. So there's a relationship between access to the internet, between access to desktop computers or tablets rather than sort of feature phones that people in developing countries might use. Broadband might be a requirement. So all these things sound really simple, but if you're thinking about a project, and if your audience is older, or if your audience is rural and they don't have broadband, then maybe you need to think about the kind of project that you're designing. But for me, the most interesting way of thinking about impact is thinking about engagement. And there's particularly something about looking at handwritten text that really seems to draw people in. We also see it with tagging images, so people looking at images. The act of tagging creates a relationship with an image that people don't have. You've all probably seen this when people walk through a gallery and they'll just kind of like walk through really quickly and maybe look at a painting and stop and look at a caption. They're spending like a second looking at each painting. If you're tagging an image, you're spending longer with an image, you're actually noticing things about it, you've got an active relationship with that image. And for some reason, handwriting, whether it's the trace of the person who wrote the original document, whether it's the fact that you're looking at a physical artifact that someone else has touched and held and used, seems to have a really deep effect on people. So we see a number of projects where people have transcribed handwritten text, where they've gone on to investigate the things behind that text, whether it's the discipline of history, or the disciplines related to, it could be biology if it's people collecting faunal specimens. But there's something that gets them more interested, and it creates a new relationship. So one example that I like is the Herbarium at Home project. People were volunteering to transcribe faunal specimen sheets. So that's collectors go out, they find a fern, they put it on a sheet of paper, they write a label when they collected it, and maybe a label of the species, and that ends up in a museum. So some of these sheets are 150 years old. People transcribing them they started seeing the same handwriting again and again, and they started thinking about the individuals behind those records. They started compiling entries of when different people had been collecting where. So the guy behind the project made a wiki that linked through, so you could say, Jane Smith was collecting on Saturday the 3rd of April 1854, and then the next Saturday she was collecting again, but she was in a different region, a different county of the country. So you could see, mapped across time and space, where these people were, and that gave them a real sense of who they were. So the project adapted to deal with their interests. And bearing in mind that these were people who were interested in biology, some of them started doing sort of mini biographies of the people, so they learned how to use census records, birth, death, marriage records, to go and find out more about their lives. They worked out that some people were married, some people were father and daughter, others were brothers who went out collecting things. So it gave them a whole new interest. They learnt new skills while doing it, and they also sort of really bonded as a community over the process. And I think that's one thing that's really key. If we think back to volunteering as an example, it's that chance to sit down, have a cup of tea, have a chat with someone while you're working or while you're having a break when you're doing physical volunteering. That's really important. And online communication can be really important for volunteers as well. Giving people a chance to do things online also gives them a chance to display expertise they wouldn't have a chance to display anywhere else. So in this example, people working on ship's logs collect instances of the handwriting that you'd encounter in a log so that you've got a sense of how to translate or how to interpret handwriting. So they're talking about the way that one particular clerk wrote T, the letter T. They've collected different examples so that you can get a sense of, sometimes he wrote it like this, sometimes he wrote it like that. If you've worked on handwritten documents, you know that it can be really difficult sometimes to know exactly what letter someone was writing. Is it a D? Is it an L? So they have created this intense documentation for each set of logs. Like, it's really exemplary. And they've done that voluntarily, they've done that while transcribing. And they've done it in part because there's a forum who can keep them going. They say thank you, they answer questions, they ask questions. They know that when they do this, it's going to be appreciated by the people doing the transcribing. So when communities of participants really take off, we see not only sort of social chit-chat, but we really start to see communities of practice, which are places where traditionally they might be in the workplace. You might start out as an apprentice or start out as a junior, and you'll learn by observing people around you. How do they organise the marketing for this? How do they work out what size an exhibition case has to be? You're learning through being in the environment. So in online communication, it sort of works the same way. People ask questions, they answer questions. Because it's online, there's often a kind of extensive ad hoc documentation system where you can search for previous discussions and get a sense of what people have done in the past. And also because it's online, you can lurk, so you can read them without having to be visible to the community, which is a really safe way for people to learn skills, to learn the language, to get a sense of what's appropriate in different communities before they take that first step of posting. And when these communities of practice really take off, then you see people actually learn skills the same as they might do in a sort of discipline-specific undergraduate course, for example. So tutorial systems where you will read something and then ask questions. They can kind of work the same way. So in thinking about how museums can have impact on society, supporting this kind of work can go far beyond the traditional work that museums would do in terms of come in, learn something about the history of this region, learn something about the natural history of these rocks, and go away and sort of, we'll never see you again, or we might see you when the next exhibition comes up. When museums are able to offer input, to offer expertise, to answer questions, to provide guidance, sometimes it can be a really light touch. Then they can start to transform their relationship with audiences. But of course, sitting around on forums all day does take time. So there are some challenges that museums have to deal with. I think one of the key things is really that balancing act between the core task, which might be transcribing ship's logs, and how much time people spend on the forum discussing what they're doing. So which is more valuable to you? Do you want people to be just purely productive, churning through those numbers, or do you want people to be discussing and learning and thinking about how the ship's logs related to the history of the region? There's examples where they're looking at ships that travelled through the First World War. They were thinking that they'd started to see the first signs of the Spanish flu, which is an amazing thing for a community to find and to start to share and to bring back to people working on the project. But that meant that they weren't transcribing records. So which do you value more? How are you going to measure them? How are you going to convey that to people? You have to sort of think about where you fall on that balance between productivity and immersion in the subject. The good news is it's really easy to get a project up these days. There are a number of technical platforms that you can sort of put material up really quickly, start to see how it works. You don't have to go and build your own platform anymore. This has made it a lot easier to get started. Each of the platforms has their quirks. At the library, we run days or 2-hour sessions we call Hack and Yaks, and the idea is that we try out a tutorial, we try out a new tool. And it's a way for us to really quickly sort of test out something and see if it's going to work for us. It can be hard to find that time for experimentation otherwise. But one of the issues is with the growth of platforms is that there are only so many participants to go around. And I've spent a lot of time sort of lurking on participant forums. When a new project starts, they all go off and they check it out. And they report back and they say, oh, it's fantastic images, it's a really great purpose, but I didn't like the way they did this, or I didn't like the way that happened. Participants are really savvy. They'll look at your project and they'll compare it to what they know about other projects. So they're checking you out, which puts a lot of pressure on the design. So the design is part of the recruitment. And this is a slide I use when I'm teaching because I think that for formal big institutions and for academics, we're really used to writing tutorials and guidelines and documentation, where Angry Birds just teaches you the in-game physics by getting you to fling things across a screen. It points, it makes things flash, it makes things have emphasis, so it's teaching you while you're playing. And it's actually a really great way to work on a crowdsourcing project, but it means that you really need to think about design. You need to allow time to iterate on design. You need to understand the ranges of inputs that you're going to have. You need to understand the different mental models that people will bring to a project. And that can be really difficult for organizations where maybe used to designing exhibitions. We can think about 3D design, about accessibility ramps, we can think about vinyls that go on the wall. We're not necessarily as used to thinking about what quality means in an online experience. But design is really important. And one reason it's difficult is that you have to design for people who contribute once and never come back, and people who contribute hours and hours a week. So this is a visualization of contributions to the Old Weather project, which is transcribing ship's logs. All these little tiny dots down there that are blurring into one, that's one person's contribution. So it might be someone who's transcribed just a single page. And this one up here is one person's contribution. So she's an incredibly productive contributor. You need to design for both, because if this woman was hit by a bus, which would hope never happened, then immediately your productivity on the project is going down, or if someone got a new job. So you need to design for both ends of the thing. You need to design for experts, for newbies, and that can be quite tricky as well. And the only way you'll know if your design is working is if you let people explore a project early and if you allow time to iterate. When I'm advising organisations about designing participatory projects, people often come to me with these really crazily complex things. It's like, you do this, and then you do that, and then you go over here and you look this up, and then you... And I'm like, would you ever do that? Like, would you, if no one was paying you, would you actually do this task? And like, no. It's like, well, why do you think anyone else would do it? Sometimes tasks are necessarily complex, but there's often ways that you can break them down. And it's important to do that because the more complex a task, the more time it takes, the fewer the people with the time, the willingness, or the skills to do it. So if you can break things down into tiny tasks, then you'll reach more people. And often there's ways that you can break things down so that the complexity kind of builds over time. And I think one really challenging thing for organisations is that if you work in an institution that's based around physical visitors, you work for years on an exhibition, you get all stressed and then you paint it all over, and then you get the interactive displays in, and then it launches, you have a glass of wine, people come in, it's fantastic. Everyone goes and collapses, and then they start the next project. Online projects don't work like that. When you launch a project, people expect that they're going to give you feedback. They're expecting that you'll listen. They're expecting that they have a right to tell you things about your project. So it's a really good idea to make sure that you've got time after a project launches to iterate, to improve, because some people will come up with absolutely genius suggestions. Sometimes the suggestions are like, well, that would be a different project, so thank you, but we can't do that. And sometimes it's things that you really want to do. And sometimes it's just really obvious bugs that you didn't see until people started using the project. So you can save everyone some hassle by allowing time to fix things after launch. And even better, if you can start to find your communities and work with them as you build it, then they're seeing it as it works. And that gives you a way to make sure that it's actually going to work for your target audiences. And it's really boring, but having worked as a museum database person for a long time, we don't always think about what we're going to do with the data that we get. So you get these transcriptions. How do you add the transcriptions back to your newspaper records? If you get new metadata, how do you add that back? If you get identifications of people in images or places, where does that go? What metadata systems does it fit in? So think about how that's going to work. It's really boring, but it's really important because you want to show people that you've valued their contributions, that you're looking after them, that they're backed up when your other data's backed up. And finally, one thing to think about is planning a graceful exit. So a number of projects have finished because they've run out of material, and that's an amazing achievement. But you need to think, you've created this project, you've created a community, where do people go next? So maybe you could contact another project and say, hey, we've got all these people who've been looking at knitting patterns from the 1950s. Have you got anything like that that you'd want them to work on? So either you can import new material or send them to a new place. I have seen projects that have just said, thanks everyone, bye, and they've shut down the site. And people who had friendships on that site, who had records that they'd saved, material they wanted to go back to, you've actually destroyed a relationship as well as, you finished your project, but you've had all these other effects as well. So plan for a graceful exit. I think one of the most challenging things that I'll leave you with is this idea of crowdsourcing online participation means going to things that we do for audiences to things that we do with audiences. And that means changing how we work. It means changing what we think expertise is, what we think authority is. It means changing how we look at the world. And my final thought is that crowdsourcing is like hosting a party. It's fantastic. You send out invitations, you plan where everyone's going to go, you make a cloakroom, you make snacks, you make some cocktails, you put wine in the chiller. When it comes time to finish, you don't just turn off the lights and say, all right, see you. You sort of gently hint that it's time to be going. You run around, you introduce people to each other, you make sure that people are comfortable, that the room is not too cold and not too warm. That takes time, that takes resources. If you don't have the resources to do this, if you don't have the time and the organizational capability of doing it, then maybe crowdsourcing isn't the right thing for you, because it is an important way of creating relationships with your audiences. So you want those relationships to be good, and apply the same kind of quality control to online projects that you'd apply to in-person projects. So with that, I'll say thank you and see if there's any questions.